When you think about some of Britain's most celebrated television personalities, the name Jimmy Savile often comes to mind, at least for those who grew up in the 60s, 70s and 80s. He was, simply put, everywhere. Top of the pops. Jim'll fix it. He was the quirky man with the platinum blonde hair, the buzzing energy, and that eccentric edge. And, well, most importantly, he was seen as a champion of good causes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was like this untouchable figure of kindness, right? All those big charity events, the seemingly endless fundraising for NHS hospitals. He even had this hands-on presence going out and visiting schools, hospitals, wards. He was seen as someone who genuinely cared about people.
Exactly. He wasn't just a showman. He was a philanthropist, or that's what it seemed anyway. He raised millions for hospitals like Stoke Mandeville and Leeds General Infirmary. He created this saintly image of himself, someone who deeply cared for society. People loved him, respected him, trusted him.
Trusted him blindly, you mean?
Yes, blindly. But see, behind this carefully crafted image, there were rumours, whispers. Hundreds of allegations would eventually surface, painting a very different picture of Savile. A picture of someone using that public trust as a cloak for something much darker.
And it wasn't like these whispers came out of nowhere. Even back in the 1970s, there were murmurs of inappropriate behaviour. I mean, some media outlets tried to investigate, didn't they?
They did, but nothing really stuck. Allegations would fizzle out, often dismissed, silenced or overlooked. In fact, 2 police investigations were conducted during his lifetime, one in 1958 and another as late as 2008. Both inconclusive. And, well, it's easy now to see these as massive missed opportunities to stop him earlier.
And isn't it awful to think about? All that evidence in plain sight, swept aside or maybe not even seen for what it truly was. It's chilling.
It is chilling. But for decades, he continued, unchecked. Everything began to unravel in 2012. An ITV documentary, Exposure, The Other Side of Jimmy Savile, aired shocking accounts from his victims. For most of us, myself included, it was like a bucket of cold water. Suddenly the man many admired was revealed to be, well, something monstrous.
And those accounts, my goodness, they were harrowing. Victims came forward, speaking of abuse that spanned across schools, hospitals, and, frighteningly, even the BBC's studios. What stood out to me was it was the sheer scale of it.
Indeed. The revelations triggered Operation U-Tree. During the investigation, over 450 allegations of abuse by Savile were confirmed. And ultimately, there were more than 589 reported victims, the youngest being just 8 years old. It spanned decades, 50 years in fact. That's practically an entire generation's worth of victims.
It's staggering. I genuinely can't wrap my head around how someone could, operate at that scale without being stopped sooner. Especially someone so public.
Well, I think that's one of the really damning elements of this whole situation. Savile wasn't working in the shadows. He was hiding in plain sight, using his fame and those charitable connections as both a shield and a tool. And to think society admired him for so long.
I know. It's like this massive betrayal of public trust. It's no wonder people are still grappling with the enormity of it all.
And we'll explore exactly how this went on for so long as we continue this discussion. How institutions like the BBC played a role, or rather failed to act in ways that could have made a difference.
Now, as we delve deeper, let's focus on the institutions themselves, because Jimmy Savile didn't operate in a vacuum. The betrayal of trust we talked about wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He was enabled, shielded even, by structures and systems that turned a blind eye time and time again.
Right, let's start with the BBC then. This is an organisation we trust to educate, entertain and safeguard. And yet,
it became one of the environments where Savile thrived most. During his tenure, the BBC was steeped in what we might now call a culture of silence. Allegations, rumours, those whispers we mentioned in Chapter 1, Many of them found their way into BBC corridors.
And nothing was done?
Almost nothing, yes. There were concerns raised during his time, but they rarely, if ever, reached the ears of senior management. It's been revealed that producers and colleagues were aware of, or at least suspicious about, his behaviour. Some even confronted him, only to be met with denial or deflection. He controlled the narrative so effectively.
It just seems so surreal. He was at the heart of shows like Top of the Pops and Jim'll Fix It, surrounded by kids, yet no safeguards really existed.
Exactly. Safeguards were either inadequate or outright ignored. Later inquiries, like the Dame Janet Smith review, exposed just how widespread the ignorance was. The BBC's internal policies failed entirely to protect people, whether they were young talents, studio guests, or even staff. The review uncovered misconduct on BBC premises, and even after those revelations, questions remained about accountability.
And all of this, while he built what looked like a saintly reputation, I can't get my head around it.
Sadly, it wasn't just the BBC. We've also got to talk about the NHS. Savile maintained a strong presence within NHS facilities for decades, exploiting his so-called philanthropic endeavours to access and abuse vulnerable patients. Victims there ranged, get this, from as young as 5 to as old as 75.
5 years old? It's just disgusting. I mean, how on earth was he allowed such access?
Through a combination of his celebrity status, charm, and, frankly, negligence on the part of the institutions involved. Hospitals, like Stoke Mandeville and Leeds General Infirmary, afforded him unchecked access. He wasn't just a visitor, he was invited into their inner workings, given keys even. It was only after rigorous investigations that the scale of this abuse became horrifyingly clear. Formal apologies followed from health authorities, as did acknowledgements of systemic failures.
But what does that even mean, systemic failures? Like, where exactly did they fall down?
Well, it meant there were no robust processes in place to question his role, his behaviour, or even the legitimacy of his intentions. It was a different era, of course, one where deference to public figures trumped scrutiny. But that's not much of an excuse, is it?
No, absolutely not. And it wasn't as though there were no warning signs.
Warning signs, indeed. Investigations, like those under the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, showed us just how many reports were ignored over the years. They revealed an epidemic of institutional neglect, cultures where silence reigned, where concerns weren't escalated, and where predators like Savile could operate without much fear of consequence.
And the aftermath? I mean, what changed after all of this came to light?
Well, for one, there was public outcry. Charities linked to Savile, like the Jimmy Savile Charitable Trust, were shut down. Honours he once held were stripped. His very name was erased from countless tributes, plaques removed, halls renamed. And it wasn't just about erasing him. These actions were also about addressing deeper issues, starting conversations about safeguarding that were long overdue.
And those conversations, they still matter. They're pushing us all to question how we approach power and accountability. Honestly, it's about learning from this horrifying case so history doesn't repeat itself.
Exactly. And as we explore in the next chapter, the ripple effects of these revelations didn't just stay with the institutions. They reached far beyond, shaping how our entire society thinks about abuse, trust, and celebrity culture.
As those revelations rippled outward, reshaping not only institutions but societal attitudes, there came an immediate reckoning with Jimmy Savile's legacy. Here was a man once lionised, celebrated, but his name became a symbol of betrayal and horror.
Right, and it wasn't long before society rejected everything associated with him. Plaques, tributes, even his gravestone were removed, almost overnight. And honestly, it felt like this collective outrage, you know? People wanted to erase his presence.
Yes, but that rejection wasn't just about erasing the man. It was about confronting what he represented. Savile had fooled everyone, and so removing these markers became a way of saying, we won't stand for this anymore. We need better safeguards.
And that's where movements really came into play, wasn't it? Feminist groups, advocacy organisations, they seized this moment to demand change, to push for stronger protections for children and survivors. They weren't just reacting, they were building something better.
Exactly. It's remarkable how these movements found power in this tragedy to push for reforms, changes to safeguarding policies, better victim support systems, more robust whistleblowing protections. And all of this stemmed from an absolute refusal to let history repeat itself.
But let's talk about the survivors for a moment, because their courage was, and still is, incredible. So many came forward under enormous pressure, reliving their traumas to ensure their voices were heard.
Absolutely. These were ordinary people who showed extraordinary bravery. For decades they were silenced, either by fear or societal indifference. But when they finally spoke up, they didn't just break their own silence, they shattered ours too.
Yeah, their testimonies, they're heartbreaking. But also, I think they're empowering. They refused to let what happened define them. And that strength, their resilience, it's inspiring.
It is. And it's a stark reminder of the power of shared stories. When victims speak out, it not only helps themselves, it also galvanizes change. These accounts became the foundation for understanding, for learning, for ensuring safeguards are in place to protect others.
And I think that's one of the big lessons here, isn't it? Listening, truly listening to survivors. It's the first step toward accountability and transparency.
And it's a lesson that's gained so much traction since the scandal. We've seen organisations overhaul their practices, implementing stricter safeguarding mechanisms, accountability frameworks, all while ensuring whistleblowers are protected. It's not perfect, but we're moving in the right direction.
But it's not just about policies, is it? It's about creating a culture that values honesty over image, transparency over reputation. That's how we make real progress.
Yes, progress born from pain, but progress nonetheless. The key takeaway from this tragedy, if there is one, is how vital it is that we remain vigilant, that we don't let power, celebrity, or influence blind us to the facts, to what's right.
And we all have a part in this, don't we? It's not just up to organisations or governments. It's on all of us to foster a society where survivors feel safe to come forward, and where abuses can't just be swept under the rug.
Well put. And on that note, let's remember this. Jimmy Savile used his fame to harm, but those he harmed, the survivors, they've used their voices to heal, not just themselves, but to help protect generations to come.
And that's something worth holding on to. It's their courage, their resilience, that's become the real legacy here. Thank you for joining us today. And until next time, let's keep learning, questioning, and building a better future.